Okay, I'm going to start with a few introductory remarks in both, or in the name of Michael and I. So just to remind you what this event is and what is not. So it's something based on a double concern. The first is to discuss a number of issues we consider as important today regarding the role of theory and history in design school. This role is changing rapidly because of external factors such as the growing place of digital technology, the change in studio curriculum, but also internal one. And I'm thinking here of the evolution of the disciplines in the past years. Themes and method have changed. A second idea, a bit utopian, is really to have a discussion event. We have a lot of opportunities to present at conferences, seminars. We more rarely take the time to exchange within our respective schools. And so this explains the relatively non-conventional form of this event. Instead of a series of traditional presentation, I've asked the participant to present short arguments to provoke debate. And then really you are supposed to make the show, the rest of the room, and discuss and throw ideas and say you're against or you're for or whatever. This is really about having a conversation. So we've chosen 4 topics that correspond to question, once again, that we consider as relatively urgent. The first is really about what is today, what are the objects of theory and history? Is it objects really, agency, mediation, etc.? The second issue will be about teaching history in the digital age. I've prepared a scathing critique of MOOCs. The third revolves around the most discussed issue of global history versus canon. And finally, theory, history, and studio teaching. This is an event. One of the ideas also behind the format is that I'm supposed to chair a bizarre thing called the platform in theory history. It took me a while to figure out what this was, but I think it's about having a conversation. So this is sponsored by the platform in theory history. And this is co-sponsored by the PhD program in architecture, landscape architecture, and urban planning with the support of the Harvard University Graduate School of Arts and Science and the Goshman Fund. And we have quite a number of our PhD students with us and others who are also welcome. And I do count on the active participation of everyone. Let me just remind that this is the 10th anniversary of our annual PhD conference, the Cambridge Talks. And this event is in a way a celebration of how a vibrant community we are. We don't even need to make a conference every year to look smart. So this is the idea to celebrate, in a way, the constant involvement of the doctoral students in the intellectual life of the school. So most of the participants come from the GSD, because we wanted really it to be a conversation about, where we are at the GSD, etc. But we have a number of guests, and I would like to thank them. Ezra Akshan, who's not yet. Oh yes, good, you made it. You survived. Not too bumpy.
It was bumpy, but
Okay, because when I saw the wind this morning, I just had a oops.
7 hours delay.
Oh my God.
7.
But still don't
7 hours.
Oh my God, well thank
from Ithaca.
Thank you really for making it. We have Mary-Lou Lopsinger from the University of Toronto, and finally Timothy Hyde, who had to make the longer distance coming from MIT, and we know this is almost impossible to cross this divide. So thank you, Timothy, for being here. Thank you for all the GSD faculty, John, Jorge, Ed, Sonia, I don't know where she is. And hello, and everyone. I certainly have forgotten someone. So I promise to be brief. This is it. Thank you all, and we start. Yeah.
Good afternoon, all. Antoine asked me to be brief, so I produced these notes, and he said they're too long, so I'm cutting them. So let me get directly to the point. It's my task to introduce Mary-Louise Lobsinger, who's the Associate Professor at the University of Toronto at the J.H. Daniels Faculty, School of Architecture, Landscape and Design. And in my prepared statements, which I'm now foregoing, I was going to make a case for why media discourse analysis began in the city of Toronto, specifically in the month of October 1939, with some events having to do with Eric Havelock. But I will skip over those in preface for drawing your attention to a recent writing by a very limiting piece by Mary Lou called Architectural History, The Turn from Culture to Media, that appeared under the rubric of field notes in the JSAH. She'll be in dialogue with our own Michael Hayes, who's the Elliott Noyes Professor of Architecture Theory at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And with regard to this media discourse analysis I referred to a moment ago, or Mary Louise even refers to as a post-Kitlerian climate of opinion, Michael has enjoyed a certain form of ubiquity as founding editor of Assemblage, the critical journal of architecture and design culture, which ran from 1986, which in fact was the year of publication of Kittler's gramophone, film, and typewriter, through 2000, a nice millennial bookmark. This is what we might call legacy media. It was a print journal. He was also quite notably the author of Modernism and the Postmodernist Subject, The Architecture of Hannes Meyer and Ludwig Hilbesheimer. And finally, Per Bruno Latour, about whom I'm sure we'll hear a great deal about today and tomorrow, and his statement that we never were modern, so perhaps should we not be surprised at the collapse of the subject and object distinction, which is simply to say that the subject perhaps yielded to the opposition at some point along the way, while the object still remains in view, or at least how it's pitted as an arguable entity or integrity against the study of agency and media, which appears in the heading of today's discussion. So with that, Mary Lou, welcome, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you. And thanks to thanks to Antoine and to Michael for inviting me. And I'm not sure how to handle the title as it was delivered a couple of weeks ago. So I'll just dig in by kind of skipping over it and getting to the thrust of an argument, which continues from the piece that I published in JSAH, the last part of that piece. But to begin with, should we give precedent to the built work to history of objects? Yes. Immediately we need to ask, what are the ways of doing history of objects? What are the materials of the architectural history? Should we study agency and media? Yes. Immediately we must ask, what are the strategies for study? What are the materials and techniques of study of agency and media? Can we study agency or media without objects, or by means of the old objects of traditional architectural history? The same examples over and over again, so readily at hand for every occasion. My interest is in the how-to, rather than the difference between subject and object, which has been brought up so far. I'm interested in the methods that can engage a process of coming into object form of the built environment. The how-to of how to do history, the how-to, the dexterity and nimbleness of how to do historicize, how to teach. And these are linked, how you historicize and how you teach, especially when confronted with that. How to talk about this drawing. Is this an object? Where does it fit within the history of objects, a medium or more? It is an object, a graphic, a writing, an aesthetic, a device, a technique, evidence, technicity, and foregrounds media and a field of material relations. Or this, how to engage what appears outside the cultural, how to analyze, how to direct attention to non-cultural elements of the technological regime. When we confront, or we should recognize these, especially in present history, the timeliness of these historic objects, how do we study them? Or this, this should be next. This is a diagram for technological transfer. If you were teaching in the city, and I did teach this last week in my survey course, it's a drawing presented, or a set of diagrams presented, the RAND Corporation to Mayor Lindsay and this is Los Angeles, and one was presented also to Mayor Lindsay in New York for the organization and management of the city. And I'm sure the students would have preferred to have been taught Colin Rowe. They're from the same time period. How do we historicize, teach, and learn from lessons long ago? So the lessons long ago, I'm going to go back. There, to that one. As lessons long ago, Nietzsche's untimeliness is in the case our subject matter. Those supposed traditional objects of study can appear untimely in the present, just as the images I just showed you appeared completely untimely as historical objects in the 1960s or 70s. Their supposed traditional objects of study, whole dispositives, objects of history, should not be overlooked, disparaged within pedagogy, even if they have entered into, in this time, a state of nostalgia. Not these, but what we would consider objects of history. We are in a sort of moment of the state of nostalgia, a future that is past that never really was. So we have to be wary of this. So what do we think about, again, these evidences of these drawings, if you will, are evidences of material communications. What is the excluded of the late 1970s? And I'm going to return to the 1970s again. A major part of the argument is around a discourse or a conversation then. These disappeared under the theoretical burden of cultural critique at that time. They disappeared for quite a long time and have only recently reappeared as being of historic interest, of being relevant to the present history of architecture. So what we need to ask then is what has disappeared, or what I'm interested in asking in this context, and at the end of the essay I wrote on methods for the JSAH, is what disappeared within the so-called cultural turn of the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s. With that mention of assemblage, I would also mention, of course, there's the key article by Frederick Jameson that is now collected in the cultural turn. Come back to that later. So I wager that Antoine's invitation to participate in today's conversation came by way of that essay. It might be interpreted as staking out a claim for media theoretical modes of inquiry, for architecture as medium, as an infrastructural mechanism, as a technical object, as an apparatus in its fullest implications, as a technical object, comprised of components but not limited or merely the visible parts, in support of a processual style of research, as elements, modes associated with media archaeology or media theoretical ways of doing history. And I have to say, even though that article might seem to announce that I'm on that side, I'm not really totally there. Okay? So I think at halfway now. I have a bit more to, okay. I know I wrote way too much to get it in 15 minutes, so I'm trying to go through. In the remaining time, I want to take up where I left off with that little essay on method and quickly present a historical context for the reception of Foucault's discourse method. Because, and this may seem like a leap, but a lot of these conversations, whether it be Latourian or Kittlerian, whether it be the cultural turn, whether it be Tafurian, or as I just mentioned, Teyceau, it's around a reception, an interpretation or misinterpretation of Foucault. I'm not going to go through that. I'm going to give you some of the interpretations. So his discourse analysis is somewhere in the background of most strategies associated with agency and media. And I'm not sure that that inquiry into those strategies has been taken to the fullest. So in this turn, so this is a turn around a few events from the late 1970s. I think I have a slide. Oh. And this is just to provoke. Because stand in because I don't know the others. So, and to do this, I have to skip over a bunch of things, if you'll like. So this is a turn around a few events in the late 1970s. This Venice School, among others, interrogating culture, capital C, on the brink of the so-called cultural turn and the failure to grapple, I would argue, with the materiality of techniques and technology, where the tension between the cultural and the technical is alleviated through words, resolved through discourse. Those works, drawings of gears, gadget, network systems, and schedules, which I showed you, rendered empty to be about something other than architecture or merely dumb communication techniques and strategies, rather than techniques evidencing the materiality of communications, the pieces and parts, visible and invisible, in technicities left in the shadows of architectural history and theory. So I'm first going to quote, to give us a kind of point of departure for the word culture. I'm not going to use Jameson in that. I'm going to use Gilbert Simondon from Culture and Techniques of 1966. So quoting, I thought would be the easiest way. I hope it comes across. Quote, the word culture entails a value judgment, and to a certain extent, it relates to an axiological type of content. When used with reference to human culture, its primary meaning is metaphorical, and it's around the metaphorical and the etymological that I think we have trouble with Foucault and other interpretations. Since it looks to the techniques of grain production, for example, and gardening for a paradigm of improvement and transformation, a paradigm that might have been found in a domain closer to human reality, notably in the example of animals transformed by breeding and farming. So that's from a book called Culture and Techniques of 1960, and that's very important. It's a philosopher trying to put together culture and techniques, which I claim will be split again later. And here to note the relationship between exchange, recursively, of culture and technique, and a step away from human culture. How am I
Howard Thomas. Where's our...
Okay, good. Now I want to turn to Carlo Ginzburg, which is not this, for microhistory. Now I'm in the 1970s, but his work begins on microhistory in the 1960s, his first book, and where he discovers the evidence in an archive, a stray piece, a quotation that prompts him to respond to Foucault. He will say that in the introduction to The Cheese and the Worms, Il Formaggio e Vermi of 1976, I Vermi of 1976. And it's really important here to understand that that word's been, or that strategy has been used in many different ways, but it is not adhering to what originally microhistory was thought to be about, or how it was argued in terms of Ginsburg's own work. So I'm going to use quotes again for this, too. The diffidence of the historians usually approaches these kinds of materials, the stray, the outside, the excluded, undoubtedly due to widespread persistence of an aristocratic conception of culture. That culture is a matter of upper classes, the diffusion of a matter of mechanical circulation. He means through texts that are published, through citations in the word. But the diffidence of historians has another more understandable reason of methodological, and this is where my concern lies, rather than ideological order. In contrast to anthropologists and students of popular traditions, historians obviously begin with a great disadvantage. Even today, culture of the subordinate class is largely oral, and it was even more so in centuries past. I'll draw you right to the critique that is embedded in this. It's a critique of Foucault's words and things, and a critique of Foucault's history of madness, for being interested in the acts of exclusion, but not the excluded, not the materiality of the excluded. He's interested in the discourse and the play of discourses, but not in the actuality, the materiality of them. There's another important lesson, and I think it's important to this day to take from microhistory from that point, is that you can take a singular case, and this is his argument for Menocchio, the miller, in The Worms, or The Cheese and the Worms, is you take a case, and through your mode, or your means of analyzing, you can produce generalizations. It would be my critique of some of the ways that are being used around Latourian and other ways of systems, is that in mappings, in architectural history, is you never produce the generalization out of the case. So it's about method. And he would argue cultural economy, circular, reciprocal influences between subordinate and higher classes or ruling classes, that's especially intense, and they must be tracked outside of the word alone. So we are obliged to ask here the history of objects. What does it impose on culture, on tradition, on evidential materials? Does the study of agency in media alleviate or provide a corrective to this imposition? Can we see a relationship between how I describe Ginsburg in some of the ways of working today? Now, I need to quickly move to get to the heart of the matter then, after I set this up, a couple of different ways of working, to these three books, because this is where I think it's very important to locate, because they will be important to the kinds of theories that are up today in history and theory, but also in some ways were interpreted in a particular way within the English language context through the 1980s and 90s, and were very different at their time. So the first two publications, or the first publication is a Foucault-led research in France, and it is the kind of ghost in this. It's published in 1976, And the other two is Il Dispositivo Foucault is 1977, La Macchina Imperfetta is 1980, although the conferences were at the same time. So let me get back to the text. Two publications from seminars at Venice in very different ways make up discursive mode of research and critique that mode as useful for architecture. That's what they were investigating at these seminars. They are taking on Foucault's mode of research, or strategy as they called it. So the first is in April 1977, and it becomes the Il Dispositivo Foucault, published in the same year. And the contributors, Franco Rella, Massimo Cacciari, George Stesso, Manfredo Tafuri, we all know those names from a particular period in architectural history and theory. The aim of the seminar was explicit: to test the potential of Michel Foucault's strategy. They call it a strategy. The usefulness of dispositif, or the device, or the apparatus, as we call it in English, for architectural history and historiography. They want to know if it's a useful mode for doing history. Was this device useful for history? Second publication is the one from the conference in October 1977, and published 3 years later, Le Macchine Imperfette, Architettura, Programmi, Istituzioni. And it's George Teso and Paolo Morchiello who are the editors of that volume. The third publication, I said, is the, I'm going to mess this up. I'm sorry. The French, the machines that we hear, the curing machines, I'm sorry. It coincides in time and apparently thematically, because it's 1970s, but it's a ghost because Foucault is no longer actually working this way. He's moved on. As we'll know from the Macchine Imperfetta, he's working on biopolitics, he's working on security and governmentality. And yet the publications conflate if you only read them as visually and as being synchronic in terms of same time of publication. But it's his students, Bruno Fortier, for example, who ask that they engage architecture if they are going to make these critiques of the institutions, and that's what's produced in this book. I want to quickly focus on a list of specific aspects of the architectural historian's critique of Foucault's strategy. They call it talkative tactics, le tattiche loquiche, or an analysis of mute discourses, mute strategy. First, they approve the assertion that history is discontinuous and acknowledge the legacy of Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, the pitting of the genealogy against traditional history in Foucault's work. Second, in general, the scholars agree that Foucault's strategy of analysis fails to grapple with the materiality of the techniques, the technology of architecture that comprise discursive practices specific to architecture, and therefore could not address specific instances of the physical cohesion of power in space or in architecture. Third, they call it a flight, and I'm putting them all together, but they're various. It's mostly Rella, Teso, and Tafuri who take this up. They call it a flight from any definition of a theory of power. It's a method, but it's not a theory. It's an analysis of power. It's a staging across various forms of text, the words, power, showing through words and text. Fourth, the contribution of the device, or the apparatus, is described as a strategy that arrives at the rupture of an episteme. Set that aside. But epistemes have real historical thicknesses, and they question the real historical thickness of Foucault's work. The main and repeated fault is found in the reliance of words, and this is particularly true in Teso and Tafuri's contributions. The discourse is about texts. The critique appears in both Teso's and Tafuri's contribution. Teso, they draw attention to the need to move beyond text, beyond the method of analysis. I'm at the wrap-up. For Tafuri, it is a mode of analysis, a practice that puts into discourse languages and traces of history. However, what perishes or are lost within this method of analysis is a space of confrontation, the real conflict of politics. It is a game without rules, that's what he calls discourse analysis, that falls apart and can be reassembled. It could lead to a new metaphysics. Teso says Foucault outlined a strategy of analysis, but he relies on concepts that aren't words, and he confuses words privileged over things, as concepts for the carrying of concepts, when the material can carry concepts. technology should be able to carry a concept or evidence it. And this leaves us with, he says, an abstract conception of power on an indefinite plane for the theater of battle. That last sentence, it's a quote I read because it's missing from the English translation completely. It's in a particular point at the end point in the A+U version that becomes the circulated version. And it's a pretty interesting statement, the abstract concept of power. So Teyssot and his collaborators will pursue less abstract technologies and techniques in the research published in Le Macchine Imperfette. These techniques precede architectural form, are the material consequences of law, inventions, machines, administration, water flows, and such. They use the plural dispositivi techniques of various machines prior to architecture as machine analogy, prior to the engagement of urban, and expand the engagement to the urban into the urban territory. Now, there's a few other things to say about it from Tafori's. He's quite damning of the use of text and word as pretext in advance of an analysis, but I'll leave it there. I want to just briefly, as I close out, go to this. The sphere in the labyrinth, la sphere il labirinto, in the labirinto. I'm sorry, I'm fighting a cold, so I'm a little accident. And from the first page where, and this shows another context for, so this is what Tafori is working on at the time. It's published in 1980 also. And his opening for his statement is to Ginsberg in Microhistory. But Ginsberg, who I actually interviewed on this, you know, I know he quoted us, and it was Giovanni Levi of the series editor who edited the book, not Ginsberg. He says, I don't think he quite understood microhistory in his playing through this chapter. He does take the Foucauldian critique in it, but the case that can lead to generalities, in fact, is kind of overtaken by the political, he would say, in it. That's not to change it, yes? Oh, time, okay, sorry. It was like it's back in teacher mode. Yes, do you have a question? Is that right at time? Okay, so can I add the other little part of this puzzle? One more thing?
If it's
It's very
small
short.
thing.
It's a small, short thing. You can ask me. Because, and I don't think there's an image that goes with it. No. Okay, here, I can only have an image like this. So who else is working on the critique of discourse and discourse analysis at this time in another language? Frederick Kittler. He publishes 1984 and 85. And if it's not immediately evident here, and these are some of the sites that from it's easier from gramophone film typewriter to take it, is he also takes to task the method of analysis for its reliance on text and word, its lack of material. Of course, he will take it in a completely other direction and elaborate it in a way that becomes labeled determinist. We have more of a conversation about that later, but I want to leave that hanging in it. If we look at a particular 5 or 6 years, we have a critique of something that has come to underpin, transform media strategies. I can't speak to Latourian. I haven't worked on it in a while, but the kinds of theories that are now influencing methods that come from, that appeal to agency and media investigations.
Thank you very much.
So, the visitors should know that in these sort of moments where the program reflects on itself, sometimes we who teach here feel like we're sort of playing ourselves, playing our own roles, and my students would be disappointed if I didn't start with a quotation from Theodore Adorno. So here it is for you. This is a letter that Adorno wrote to Walter Benjamin after he had read a draft of Benjamin's Paris, capital of the 19th century, and you know that was the working. There was an essay of that title, but it was actually a working title for a project, a big project, whose aim was nothing less. And here I'm quoting from Benjamin, nothing less than to recover a prehistory of modernity by excavating dream worlds, or sometimes he would say wish images, that are incarnated in the material fabric and cultural artifacts of the 19th century. This is 1935. It's an amazing statement that sounds very like material culture and media studies. And Adorno, when he read this, said to Benjamin, and he puts the word mediation in quotations, because media, the word doesn't exist yet. But he says, the mediation that I'm missing, and find, in other words, you've talked about a lot of different mediations of artifacts mediating cultural wish images and dream worlds. But the mediation which I'm missing and find obscured by your materialist historiographic invocation is nothing other than the theory which your study omits. One could say that your study is located at the crossroads of magic and positivism. That spot is bewitched, that crossroads. Only theory can break the spell. You know how much I love that. Okay, and in the work of some recent colleagues, and I'm sure I'm not talking about anybody in the room. Nobody is in the room, okay? Well, I feel the lure of that bewitched spot, and I'm really oversimplifying. I realize it because we were supposed to provoke, but read as a parable of the situation of architecture history as a present. That quotation is a kind of parable. The bewitched spot might well be some version of what we might call descriptive cultural studies, or material culture, or media studies. It might be related to what sometimes seems like, on the part of architectural historians, a kind of insecurity in the face of disciplines like anthropology, or techniques like ethnography, or more recently and more technical, like data mining. And architecture history is experimenting with and touring with, and sometimes intimidated by all these. I'm not condemning these fields or techniques, and I'm not asking for any kind of consensus about modes of working. What I want to ask is what Adorno's recommendation might mean. What might it mean against that, that only theory can break the spell? Now, just note, it seems to me, and this is the way I would understand a lot of what's going on in architecture history that reaches into media studies and material culture. What's assumed, as I understand it, is that a historiographical progress would be won by the suppression of theory. Some people are pretty explicit about that, and especially by eliminating or omitting the formalist readings that theory usually brings with it. Usually theory in architecture brings close readings of form. And there have been recent statements that progress would be made by suppressing that. And moving toward the pragmatics of history, the idea of context or multiple context, the everyday so-called, and of course in the move toward the everyday, architecture represents the elite, the not everyday. Identity politics is one of the older ones. The more recent ones, as I've said, this notion of a technical a priori, that there is a technology or a network of operations that is prior to any architecture, and that architecture can be reduced to. So these networks of technologies and institutions, network is a big word, and these recursive change of operations that reduce architecture into a kind of horizontal field that we call material culture or media culture. To break the spell then, for us, for me, as I would interpret it, would be moving away from, remember he says the intersection of positivism and magic, and there is a kind of, for me, mesmerizing pretense that the empirical description of context has a social and an ontological import all its own, that just describing what is happening is the work of the historian, and that's enough. That's the intersection, part of it, that I would see between magic and positivism. And as I said, it involves both the everyday and the technical, the tracking of sequences and operations that supposedly precede and do without theoretical discourse and framing, okay? Let me give a quick example, and I'm sorry to a little bit personalize this if I haven't already. But there's a very good example that happens to be about, and I also am doing this for the students. All the students, I talk about the Seagram building all the time as a model for how one can do deep readings and interpretations of architecture, and as a rebuttal to that, and it's actually a very good rebuttal. So I treat the Seagram building as kind of emerged in mass culture, in developing mass culture, immersed in the everyday, but resistant to it, resistant to cultural consumption. And this is the response to the essay that I wrote from someone who's interested in the media studies. Hayes claims to discern the degree to which a general crisis of the subject associated with modern media finds its architectural articulation in the curtain wall. Yet, despite the cogency of Hayes' use of Adorno, this crisis in architecture bears little resemblance to Adorno's dividing aesthetic experience from practical life and securing the autonomous abstraction as the basis of both. No, this crisis does not issue from a confrontation between architecture and mass media. It issues from that fearful moment when architecture recognizes itself reflected in the curtain wall as one among many media. Now that's exactly and concisely and powerfully the point that people turning to media studies and material culture make, that architecture is not distinct, but is only one among many media, and therefore can have no resistance, no pushback, no difference from the context in which it has been situated, which is the work of the historian. That seems fair. It diffuses architecture. So a couple of things, and now I'll end with a recommendation. And this recommendation, I realize, is going to be too unformed to maybe even to understand, but maybe that's part of what the discussion can try to pull out, because
We're used not to understand you, Michael.
well, no, but this is actually quite clear here. This one. So what I want to argue, of course, is that there is a distinction between architecture and everyday life, obviously. So what would an invocation of theory do? What might an invocation of theory do to break this spell? First of all, I think it's recognizing, and this seems very simple, but it's often not recognized, that the everyday is not the real in Lacan's sense, and it's not earth in Heidegger's sense, it's not the architrace in Derrida's sense, insofar is that the everyday life cannot ground itself without, the notion of everyday or of context cannot ground itself without some theoretical frame or metaphor or figure or artifice or ideology or whatever you want to call the kind of tropological or system of metaphor that you ground and frame in order to describe. Architecture not only recognize, the study of architecture has to not, as such, would not only recognize that you can't ground it outside its own system, architecture as an art is what reveals just that fact. I think the material culture people and the media studies people forget how artificial architecture is, how constructed architecture is, but also how it's the vocation of architecture to reveal its constructedness. And all of the column wall manipulations from Alberti forward do just that, reveal themselves as ornament, as fiction, as construction, as artifice. But because of that, architecture can never be contained by its context. It is always shifting. It is always open to reinterpretation. one day somebody else will reinterpret the Seagram building. And it's open to that. It's emphatically open to that in the way that, let's say, a technical invention might, as such, might not be. Or a pot, or might not be treated that way. So it's never sufficient merely to unmask or indict architecture, because all such a critique manages to do, all an ideology critique as architecture being elite or constructed or this way or that manages to do, is to substitute one tropological system for another, because there are no systems that don't rely on tropes or metaphors or ideologies. However, what I propose is that architecture, the study of architecture, can construct one. And here I'm following, and just to make it, try to make it, because I do it quickly, I'm following people like Paul de Man, who looks at the possibility of sort of a non-rhetorical, a prefigural, a pre-tropological, hypothetical condition against which we can then evaluate different ideologies. So you can gauge and compare only by hypothesizing not an origin, but a virtual. And I'm claiming that what another thing I would claim is what media studies, cultural studies don't have, that architecture, history, and theory does, is a notion of an architectural virtual, or say diagram, or say generating matrix that is not a template, but is a condition of possibility for being in the world. And that's the fundamental distinction that I want to make, is that there are certain human postulates. For Derrida, writing is one. For Paul de Man, what he calls inscription, marking, that there are ways that humans territorialize their place of being here, of being now, and mark that or assert that, and that those marking vocations, that architecture should be thought of as among those marking vocations which distinguish it from, one media among others. Now, one can quickly, I see Brian raising his eyebrows. One can make an ontology, as Brian reminds me, of anything. What I'm suggesting is not that one can't make an ontology of chairs, but that one hasn't. And one has made an ontology. We don't have a historian yet who's done an ontology of chairs. Okay, that's all I'm saying. They treat them as material things that as if they weren't fundamental. Okay, but that's.
You're not very interested in the history of chairs.
Oh, maybe not. Okay. I was sitting in one. It's the only reason I use it as an example. This virtual that I'm talking about, if it's whatever it is, it evokes an anteriority. It evokes an anteriority that is not really there. It's the Lacanian real. It's the Heideggerian earth. It's the condition of possibility. Okay, of things. And then, so the move toward inscription, the prefigural, is, and those of you I know, Judith Butler, so when Judith Butler talks about she disarticulates sex and gender by talking about inscription, that gender is an inscribed. That's exactly what I'm talking about. But to posit that, you have to posit that there is a condition of possibility for that inscription. I will stop with one more interesting thing that maybe we can talk about. In the wake of this kind of post-theoretical turn, throughout the period associated with this march toward a kind of empiricism, there has also been a steady return to a more and more conservative politics in the general society, within both the university and in global society, you don't have to be a Hegelian to be bothered by that. That somehow the turn against theory and form has taken place in a march toward a more conservative politics in the university. I'm not saying it's causal, I'm just saying it seems to be the case. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just, it's written here that I'm the chair. Yeah, I always forget what ontology means, so I'm doubly at a loss. I want to leave the discourse analysis dimension of this to the assembled group here, and just make some comments specifically and precisely to do with the format that Antoine recommended for us, which is a discussion. So I just wanted to say some comments about Michael and Mary Lou's comments. And I'll begin with the beginning, and I'll end with the spell that Michael was talking about, which is nothing else but a word formula. It's an incantation. It's a way of speaking which induces a beguiled way of being. So to begin with the beginning, Michael began with a quote, which I thought was interesting because it speaks to me some way of the endurability and the portability of text as much as how we want to enact all these forms of evasion or enact various tropes or turns or tropes or catastrophes by any other name and pay our attention to other forms of inscription. So it begins with a quote from Adorno. And I thought this echoed, in a way, and I use that term advisedly because the extent to which this discourse is predicated on some historical description of a turn from orality to inscription as such. But the beginning with the quote, I just draw attention to Mary Lou's use of air quotes in her talk twice. She said, I'm going to use, and she like this, which is a reversal. It's kind of a making visible of a typographical trait which reproduces a form of orality. But she then, as she said, uses quotes. And we should be mindful of what use is made of use. When we use things, they wear out, they wear down, they lose their meaning, and we have to reinvigorate them by putting them into circulation in these kind of contexts, which further threatens their becoming worn down. So the use of quotes in both these contexts, on one hand, is a kind of a grounding thing to make us familiar with Michael's discourse, and the other case in Mary Lou's to give us an instruction about something I think we're all having difficulty with, which I think was the premise of her talk. She said, I wanted to talk about how to, right? How to, and she didn't quite specify how to what, right? So I'm going to put this in the context of questions that are very familiar to all of us because many of us read the same texts. A, how to do things with words, or how to do words with things, and finally, how to deploy quotes in that way and make wise use of them without wearing them out or using them up. So those are some of the terms I wanted to put out there by way of introducing a conversation, which in polite company is a form of taking turns in speaking and attending to the cues your interlocutor gives you to when to shut up, which I will do presently. But I invite, just maybe to begin, Michael and Mary Lou to this stress on discourse as such, its place or its displacement, and what that augurs at this cultural moment, which, as Michael said, could be potentially quite dire in a non-Hegelian sense.
Can we open it to the room?
Oh, immediately? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh, that's it. It's yours.
I think we can begin to shoot on the speakers.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would like to shoot on you, Michael, because why
Shoot on
the
you.
chair, why a chair is not allowed. You know, I didn't get completely your thing about the chair. You know, I can understand the critique of not, dealing frontally with the object, I mean physical object, and dissolving it in a field, in a series of conditions, etc. But then, why specify the architectural object as so unique, etc.? was for me a little bit of a question.
Yeah.
You know, without by the end, or don't you run into the risk of, you know, producing a kind of, again and again, a kind of professional doctrine, you know, just epitomizing how unique is the architectural object?
I think,
Which
Yeah.
might be, you know, my question then could be, isn't that by the end perhaps the function of architectural theory? To tell architects how great they are.
yeah. And
I'm provoking, you know,
no, I think
in case you didn't get it.
there's, let me try this. Oh,
Matthew, did you want to
Yeah.
join in?
No, please
Okay.
respond. I will.
well, I'll just say one thing real quickly to try to be clear than to defend. And I think this is, you'll see something in this. I've been very taken recently with this, I learned this book by Wordsworth called, now I forgot the name of it. It's, Theories of Epigraphs or something. And the first line in the book, which is not a poem, it's not a Wordsworth poem, it's actually an analysis. He says, epigraphs presuppose a monument upon which they will be written. And it's the presuppose. Now, monument doesn't mean in the context a monumental building. It just means a thing. It means monument is in the context monument is very inert and available. It's just a thing. It's a stone. But it's the idea that an epigraph presupposes a monument on which it will be written. What is that presupposition? I think the presupposition that architecture also has, like writing, and by the way, and this is the moment, of course, the monument and the inscription aren't separated. It's the moment that architecture and writing are still together. And it seems like to me that's I say distinction rather than privilege that I want to give practices that worry about their own condition of possibility in a way that I think other...
Chairs don't do.
Well, you know, chair may be a singularly bad example of something, because, you know, maybe a chair does, in a way. Yeah.
Do you mind if
Yeah.
I do jump in? You know, getting back to this Adorno quote, what he's saying is presupposed is not at all the monument, right? He's talking about the social totality as
Right.
the medium in which all these artifacts
That's right.
exist,
That's
right?
right.
And you know, it seems to me that let's say media studies would take off from exactly that same point of view. It's a Marxist sort of materialist point of view. You know, thinking of, let's say, a technical a priori. I don't know. The technical or the, let's say, techno-social as a sort of medium in which these things appear. I think
Is the presupposition.
yeah, I mean, I think that's not yet totally separate. And I mean, just on this sort of ontological point, I read stuff in computer science, and there's maybe nobody who's taken ontology further. I could look at Brian, but where is he? Over here. Ontology is a very serious thing for computer science because they need to specify these virtual objects, and their being is a very serious thing for them. And there's reams and reams on ontology of virtual objects, right? I mean, so well, okay, so that's just two things to throw out there.
Yeah, and maybe I could back away just a moment to say that architects' use of media studies, not that media studies could not become philosophical, and maybe there are media theorists.
They are super philosophical sometimes.
But I think what I'm talking about is the work that I know in architecture history that tries to become media studies tend not, well, and it is the case that in architecture, theory and form have been quite explicitly rejected lately. That's yeah. So that's.
Might I jump in for a second? I think one of the really interesting things is that people, a lot of my fellow scholars of my fellow generation, meaning this kind of emerging scholars, architectural history, urban history, and so forth, have turned to media studies as a means by which to understand architectural practice, whether it's happening in the School of Architecture or it's happening out, beyond it, because of how much similarity there are, how many similarities there are in the different practices of different medias. And so I'm curious as to how your take on the role of media studies in architectural history is challenged or affirmed by your understanding of architectural practice.
Tia?
I had a question for Mary Lou. See, I was thinking about these diagrams that you had, and sometimes they're diagrams, sometimes they're models. And talking about ontology, models tend to, in constructing models, there's a question of what they are modeling, which can be seen as an ontological question. And so that's one thing. I would love to hear what you had to say about that. But the other thing is that, these diagrams that you have, they may not be column row, but they're still attached to architects. Mm-hmm. What do we do with the diagrams that aren't attached to architects? How do we study those? Because I have a lot of those in my work.
How to?
Actually,
Yeah, but the granary is like a chair.
and I think that's actually, I'm going to set aside the ontology question for but the how-to is an open question. That's what I'm interested in pursuing, if not through media studies. And I'm getting a sense I have a different understanding. It's not a kind of battle of this and that. That it's not a kind of wholesale taking on. I'm trying to figure out how to, and it doesn't exclude Adorno, do history or teach topics. So those are very different, and Matthew will know that I misrepresented exactly what was up there, because most people don't read computer stuff or systems drawings, and some of them are just kind of fake drawings. They're not really system drawings. But they often come to stand to represent either Sandra Price's or Philip Stedman's. In fact, I had Philip Stedman take me to task. He said, that's just a 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. That's like kids' grammar. What are you doing with it? And like, okay. So, but the fact that it was about architecture, but it's by people in that, trying to explain something that is maybe not even architectural in our sense, is really important to the present. Even it's from the 1960s, and I'm not sure I can point to exactly why, but I'm sure if you go up to studio here, we're always looking at these things that are probably first determined by aesthetics, and maybe afterwards by their numbers or something else, but I think we need to know the technicity, the techniques for theorizing them, if they have explanatory value, a theory as that, and for understanding them other than some change in graphic software. And I think that's really crucial. In my what I was trying to do with all those quotes really quickly was say, there was a moment where something went to culture rather than actually going deeper into what was wrong with that Cedric Price. What happened to the guys at the Cambridge School? You're going to answer that. I didn't. Why did they all lose their job when Joseph Redford got tenure as historian? I mean, that's a huge.
We all know Joseph.
So that's a little like
Not
side
a surprise.
quick, but I think that you can go, and I think that maybe I know that the
Mary-Lou, if I may just jump in, I'm wondering sometimes if the real question is not how to, but why are we doing this? Because you just mentioned, I do think the evolution of design practice and what students have on their board, etc., or rather computer screen, is also responsible for the shift. I think there is, and I think
that's
Fallon's point,
Yeah.
and I think it's actually a really, and I'm really struck by how it echoes. I was also quite struck in how the question of discourse is still with us, always come back, and we never can get rid of it.
So we need
in a
to
way,
think about
it's
it.
surprising because we never killed Foucault in some ways.
No, and it's not about dismissing. Sorry.
But it's not just about Foucault.
Yeah,
I mean,
Yeah.
there's all sorts of discourse that have
I agree.
absolutely nothing to do with the theories that we import into design school, design education,
Mm-hmm.
that have much more to do with bringing underrepresented voices and narratives into the history.
I think that's right.
So this is where I took to Ginsberg, and I quoted very quickly. And there's two things about that. Is in that case, it's looking at the rejected, the refused, the outside, not just being interested in the institutions. And that was one way of looking at Foucault's early work. He's just interested in that was one way, the text. But also what's important to take from that, and this would be if I was going to do anything semi-personal around the use of media studies and media theories, that there's a case. You can work from the object case, and you can use media studies, and you can come to a generality rather than the infinite mapping, the playing out that you never come to on theory, an evaluative moment. I think that's the crisis in some way with some of the historical work and projects that trace infinitely steel or something like that. So it's very particular. Sorry.
Someone wants to jump in? Yeah.
But no Fus. Just so you guys know, the reason we have to use the mics is because we're videotaping, not because you don't have a big voice.
I was going to kind of riff off of what you were saying, and this sounds a lot more polemical than it needed to be.
Yeah, be polemical. That's part of the
I'm
idea.
curious about, I'm sort of curious about what the points of capture are for different disciplines. In this case, architecture, right? I don't have a reason for this, but I do find it fascinating that sort of when we discuss things like theory, we do these sort of leaps, like a sort of a Benjamin Adorno sort of moment. We do like a little Derrida, Paul de Man, this moment when, all writing could be subjected to the same sort of methodologies. And we leap in that kind of way, right? But media studies, for instance, media and performance studies have a variety of scholars, right? Not just like Judith Butler, but Schechner, for instance, that have been working not just in a contemporary way, but have been working and operating on Foucault in a very sophisticated way, in a way that is significantly more sophisticated than what Teferi was doing vis-a-vis Foucault. And so my question is, like, what are the points of capture for architecture history theory? Like, at what point do we say we're not talking about media studies at all? Or if we are, we're talking about media studies when media was, an Atari 5400. I'm just
Could I tell a personal story this time? It all begins long ago in New York. So Mahfouz, I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the Chicago school, and there were some kind of sociologist types there, and someone showed Worth's diagrams of Chicago and the kind of the distribution of various races, and the sociologist said, "Oh, look, that's spatial." And I looked at it, I said, "That ain't spatial. What is that?" And I said, it's an illustration of statistical data according to the media. He said, one could look at various forms of media and understand the tropes and the ambitions and the labor of collecting the media. And one has an alibi by calling it spatial and bringing it into our discourse. But I think there's a lot of forms we deal with, or at least this historian deals with, that I consider media and have a complicated and rich history that are embedded in our discourse as such. And I wouldn't be an avowedly media studies person as such. Yeah. So I'm just trying to say where we situate these objects we work with is part of the question.
I have to say, my own experience is initially I hated the media study people, because usually you have these crappy, everything is in everything, and read Kittler and you have an idea of clarity in the world sometimes. And then I do think by the end it's a real question today. Mm-hmm. It's a real question because, I'm not against the C-gram, but can we forever teach the C-gram? shouldn't we actually enlarge it? You know, how do we construct from the CGRAM an understanding of political? It has become for me a real question. And you know, the chair, probably because I'm interested in technology, but still, you know, is there really an ontological difference? Is that interesting to reconduct an ontological difference between art and non-art, etc.? Is for me has become a completely problematic question. What I don't like sometimes with media studies is that, you know, you can read 200 pages and you're still wondering where is the concrete stuff. Sometimes, not always. And that's a little bit what I miss sometimes, is that everybody, and a little bit like the actor network theory, in which it's all going to be about concrete agency, and by the end there is a lot of discourse and little concrete agency. But that's more that.
no, but I think-
I find it interesting today to be disturbed.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons we have these panels.
I think this is very important, and I'm sorry, I just want to get this out, and then I'll stop. But that is, and I agree with that, but it's the specificity, it's being specific about the way different media organize or territorialize that to me would be important. So some of you yesterday we had a very interesting pair of presentations by Lucia Alea and John May. And one of the things that both of them were trying to do is to look very carefully and very deeply and formally at the different ways digital media and drawing, hand drawing, organize their organize knowledge, or oh, there you are, yeah, or organize their the world, right? And I think the specificity of that a lot of people are being searched. That I think that's really important. And to go back to Fallon's point, which is an important one, for me, it's precisely I'm not asking that everybody work on objects. What I'm asking is that to recognize that even things like the Seagram,
They have a right to exist.
well, that they are themselves nothing more but nothing less than a kind of coagulation of all sorts of practices, and that of course economics should be primary, of course labor studies, and the tools that were used, the areas that the steel was extracted from, all these, as far as I'm concerned, are in the object and are part of the object that a close reading should do. That what I was objecting to is what's forgotten is the specificity of media and the different ways they organize the world. Yeah.
Meredith, did you?
I would agree wholly with that, and I'd say there are a few examples, and maybe there's some dissertations on the way or some articles on the way that do this. And one of the articles I come back to is one by Laurent Stadler of ETH on the threshold. And he can take you through the idea of the threshold that we all sort of get mesmerized about, with whether we're phenomenologists, but he will take it apart through the revolving door to, the airport system. And he uses this phrase that I really like, medium, as continually resolving into moments of coherence. So he can make it material. He can make the threshold, and he can shift you from looking at just the object, but he has objects in concrete moments, and he can open them up again and close them down again. I think that's what has to happen. There are some examples, I've viewed papers or listened to papers, where it's infinite spinning of stuff that are pages representing media, and I think maybe that's what you're speaking about. And I too find those impossible, the infinite regress into what, But there are others that are on the way that are really wonderful too. Somebody who's looking at the slice in Brazil of, it's a section, it's a really wonderful section, I saw it in a paper, I think you did too, Daniel Barber's work on the Brie de Soleil. And that as a threshold and a medium, and it does all these technical things, but it also engages a wide range of things around climate and building and population. And I think that would be one that would begin, if not to engage in the way that you're asking, and that I would ask of any sort of theoretical enterprise or mode of interpretation that is based in architectural history. That would be the how to lose it.
As chair, could I exercise my prerogative to continue this question of specificity as such? And just as one footnote, Mary Lou, I was very impressed by your insistence on the idea of the general and the particular,
It's
which
really important.
I would think of in terms of the precept and the exempla. And just to note that when when Ginsberg wrote about the actual origin of the term microhistory and was writing about Stewart's work on Gettysburg, which was the first book to have microhistory in the title, he called it an almost unimaginable mass of detail, which didn't yield any kind of reasoning or meaning at all. So we always run that risk. But in service of specificity, I want to address something that Antoine puts, I think, very interestingly, equivocally, in terms of the goals of this meeting. He says, last but certainly not least, should we rethink the relationships among lecture courses, seminars, and studio? And in
We're
terms
going to talk about that tomorrow.
later, tomorrow, okay.
Yeah, that's very much, we're going to deal with the digital and,
Okay.
what the MOOCs are doing. And
Okay.
we have actually, and John and Jorge will be addressing the question of the relation to studio.
Yeah.
That's part, because I do think actually what Fallon said, I think is very important for us to realize that actually on the desk, the
Yeah.
reality has changed.
Yeah.
And I think also, to go back to another thing, I think your real problem is the reconstruction by the end of the totality of the object. Because in some ways, the Stadler piece, that does not reconstruct an architectural object at the end. It takes a theme, like a threshold, and follows it. He did also the window, as
Yes,
far as I
it did.
remember, etc. And we're into something which is close to elements. And I think today the question of the reconstruction of a totality is actually questionable. And that's because what we used to do in architecture, because we always studied in some ways revolving doors and a lot of, but it was subsumed into, the transcendent presence, the overarching
Right,
presence of the
right.
object. I think what's happening today is that is no longer granted. And,
Right.
and even going further, it's no longer interesting sometimes for people emerge into design. I may be wrong, but I have that impression sometimes.
Well, maybe we should recognize that opens up a kind of possibility in that if we're not taking elements and relentlessly then recategorizing or reconstituting the totality of the object, we don't then put ourselves in this position of creating a single class of comparable things. If we constitute buildings, objects, all we're doing is comparing one building to another building to another building to another building endlessly. And this is in part the kind of deoxygenated version of architectural history and theory, and part of the exhaustion of theory and the need to reconstitute, not get rid of theory, but reconstitute in some different term, is that its explanatory power has become kind of self-reflexive. Right? It's about buildings compared to other buildings. And so Laurent's piece, or the possibility of looking through techniques or cultural techniques, and maybe we could use that term and not just media theory, right? Because as you say,
That would be my preferred.
yeah, because then then we're not distracted by media in its other senses. Then you create the possibility of a different set of correspondences, and you might be able to realize architecture in totality in different places, but you're not assuming this class of comparable objects in advance. So in other words, you don't already assume that you're describing one of 1,000 Seagram buildings, right, and trying to articulate its differences. So we might see that in cultural technique there's a possibility to move sideways, or kind of a different orientation back in.
Recursively is the way they speak about it.
Right.
Process you recursively, yes.
And maybe just this is a smaller point, but I would point out with the Adorno quote that maybe perhaps in this discussion it's telling that he talks about a crossroads, which is a cultural technique. The road is a cultural technique, right? It's not an architecture. So he doesn't talk about a monument and then unfold a metaphor about theory based on a monument. He bases it precisely on a cultural technique, right? The road, or a specific kind of aspect of a cultural technique, which is the crossroads. So we could think maybe that these two things are not so oppositional, but kind of moving back and forth opportunistically in a how-to way.
Yeah.
To think about how to discuss architecture. how to
And that way you're very
enter architecture.
selective as you move through. You're not just beholden to a molder model, which, I'm getting the sense media seems to be taking over in some way, the way it's discussed here. So what's really key too, what Tim says is, Timothy says is difference. In Bernard Siegert and work by the group around Weimar and that, it's about creating differences. So there's a set of conditions.
Although I have to say, because of Matthew, I read the book, and the introduction is great, and then the case study are completely disappointing.
Most of them,
Because they're so classic. It's
Yeah.
almost history of ideas sometimes.
In
the
fact, it
old-fashioned
feels
sense.
old-fashioned, doesn't it? I'm glad
Yeah.
you said that, because I
Yeah,
thought
the introduction is great, and the way position Hitler versus what came before, after,
Yeah.
etc. And then you read the map, both the grid, etc. It's super boring. I had actually a question for you, Timothy. In a design school, aren't we almost, because of ideological question of the profession, obliged at some point to reconstruct a category of objects which are equivalent or not? I'm asking because, you know, we have, I don't know. So you think it's
the profession is not designing buildings. I mean, that's not where the architectural profession is going.
Okay,
So no,
good point.
so no, and I mean, I don't
That
even
might be actually the central point.
well, even outside of that, I don't think there's an obligation to coordinate every aspect of our historical work to the Advanced Degree program. But if to the extent that we do, then no, because the design of objects is no longer the direction.
And isn't that what, I mean, landscape studies, cultural studies with a lowercase c, these were all efforts, I think, to also capture these other architectural practices and bring them back into the fold of architectural history. But somehow that path was derailed largely because of this question of the ontology of this comparable set of objects. And I think, I mean, the rigor and vibrancy of landscape studies here at the GSD, I think, is one of these possibilities, maybe, that
That's
we
true,
speak
absolutely.
of, that could be an avenue towards, maybe back towards some of these older debates around, you know, how do all these things that weren't categorized as architecture, that is just like as heritage or as bureaucratic objects, like what's on the screen there, that Atea mentioned, like these things that don't usually get incorporated into the canon or into the set of objects that we consider. Like how I think that landscape studies has kind of given those conversations new breath, but I don't think that should now eclipse the value of those other epistemological conversations. So yes, the media studies debate still needs to happen, as does the cultural studies one and the discourse studies. But they are discourse analysis, cultural analysis, to be more accurate from my perspective. But yeah, I think that they.
The one thing I would add, and this is not a disagreement, it's an addition to what Timothy and Fallon was saying, is that also when we look at different sorts of things, to remember that things don't stay the same forever. Yeah, there's a kind of vibration, and it's not a vibration. It's an instability of the role of different sorts of agents and things in a network is constantly shifting, and I think we should learn to write in such a way, I'm looking at the dissertation people, that allows for a kind of difficulty and uncertainty, or at least acknowledges that a positivist settling of the network, to refer to Mary Lou's mapping, a positive mapping and a fixing is not necessarily the thing we should be after, but a fixing, a kind of temporary strategic fixing, acknowledging that things fight back, that everything in the network fights back at the network. That's
Resistance to
there's a resistance. Yeah, yeah. It's precisely. Theory is the one practice that understands that it has to undo itself to be adequate to its subject matter. Theory undoes itself in that way.
And this would be the value of the Adorno quote, but we recognize the difference between his moment and ours. So he's saying, right, the magic is effect with no cause.
Right.
That's what magic is. Positivism is cause
with
regardless of effect, because it's
Right.
all determined in
Right.
advance. Right.
Right.
So he's saying we need some
Yeah.
moment where cause and effect are coupled once again, but
Right.
in a not in an indeterminate way, but in a flexible way that changes over time.
Right.
But for him, that was called theory, and I think for us, the question we're hashing out is that it's theory and it's historical as well. Because for Adorno, the positivism was history, right? History was positivism,
well, yeah,
right? And it's no longer for us
That's right.
a positivist discipline.
That's
So-
right. That's right.
So we can use history and theory, those terms together.
Together.
In a slightly different calibration
That's right.
that he was able to.
That's
To
right.
produce that moment at the crossroads of a cause and effect being linked, described, but not reified.
Yeah.
Before you say it, Matthew, I just want to say I very much appreciate your image of the crossroads, but let's just have a Barthian moment and think that crossroads could be also trivial, right? They're not merely bisecting. There could be more promiscuous opportunities where, let's say, three roads meet, and we can transgress in a way.
May I play, however, the devil's advocate, which is the following, if we follow that track, okay, there are no category, etc. But history, the way it has proceeded was always by taking a set of canonic. We're going to talk about canon tomorrow, but let's say there is in history also the need to have recognizable configuration that you can critique, etc. The problem, for example, if everybody was doing an endless ANT, actor network theory kind of approach, by the end, the problem is apart from worshipping the semi-gods who created ANT, you don't have much to do. You see what I mean? You cannot progress because there is never a corpus on which that may enable you to advance. Because I was thinking, if we dissolve completely and we are endlessly in revolving door, there is still a moment in most architecture school in which you need to address, some canonic work of this or that, or canonic analysis, etc. If we completely flexibilize, makes everything flexible, how do we do in all this fluidity? I don't have the answer. That's a very naive question. But that's for me a question, because we still teach Palladio in many schools, which is, so actually if we were really to follow your program, we would teach actually a number of case studies of these complex web, etc., and why privilege Palladio. And that we're going to deal with that tomorrow. But that's a fundamental question, because the problem when you don't deal with Palladio is that, you say something and then something else, etc., and you never have a way to base yourself. Because in some ways, you take the aggregates, for example, if you hadn't had the classic history of architecture to criticize, you would be completely in a swamp. You see what I mean? Because you needed actually as a countermeasure, you needed in some ways to dynamite the building because you had in a way the building. But once everything is in flux, atoms, networks, etc., how do you do? How do you imagine the post-aggregates? Are they going to return to Palladio?
This is a similar succession, right? You didn't have theory without the positivists who preceded you.
Right. I needed the positivists, yeah.
Yeah, but it was easier because there was a set of things that had been interpreted in such and such a way. You see what I mean?
I see what you mean. I don't know that was easier.
I'm not saying that it was easy, but I
just don't think those things were so similar, right? The chart that Mary Lou showed, the RAND Corporation chart, right? That's at that moment. That's the positivists that then produce the kind of moment of theory following them. That's not an agreed set of kind of canonical things.
Yeah.
So we're thinking a very narrow bandwidth of what did a few architectural history courses teach from 1900 till now, not what was happening in architecture schools from 1900 till now. So an architecture school in 1970 has a RAND consultant talking about the weaponization of the inner city, right? That's nothing to
It's
do
Melville
with
Branch.
Palladio.
It's Branch.
Pardon?
It's the Melville Branch diagram you showed.
No, it was one produced for LA, and it was
it's
about
Melville Branch.
understanding Watts. It was very racialized. It was
I use it too.
Could Matthew, I just also want to speak to my wallflower essence and make sure people on the outer perimeter get a chance to speak. Someone. My
Someone
fellow
back.
wallflowers.
We have 7 minutes left.
Well, I wanted to.
No. Matthew. We
So-
stayed behind you.
Can I give a personal anecdote? Michael's here.
No.
It's a long time ago, 1996, when I was a PhD student in a first year here, I knew Cedric Price. I went to the Cedric Price archive, and I found all these things that looked like that. But it wasn't worthy of dissertation material.
So Matthew, you can say something then, since you're
I
dealing with
instead
the
wrote
code.
on Italy because I have languages, I
Well,
suppose. But this is actually funny, interesting, but also the moment of blindness within, and not this as much, within a theoretical paradigm. when you can't see. That's what's part of what I'm interested in looking at, when you can't see. So if we can't see what was interesting theoretically, you could kill that diagram with Adorno, with cultural critique, with all it was like just technical. Instrumentality, poof, gone, right? And so that was actually really interesting to me when I was a doctoral student.
That was probably because I come from history of technology initially.
You
All
weren't-
these
I
crappy.
weren't-
I didn't have all these problems, all these material for me is, almost less boring than what I dealt very often.
But it was interesting point for me in my education. It's like, oh, why isn't this? Why doesn't it fit? Why does it disappear? Why does this work disappear under the lenses, the frames, the kind of critiques we're using, which I'm totally involved in? I would write about them, right?
Okay.
So that's, I think, a crucial question we have to ask ourselves all the time.
I think we've
All the time
become
about the
more
work we're looking at.
tolerant. I think
It's
in
not
some ways.
intolerance.
No, but I'm serious. I think in a PhD program, to be honest, the problem, is that you always, by definition, have new generation of scholars who arrive with very different take on the discipline. And I think probably PhD program have evolved from very, in a way it was very doctrine producing when it started. And I think there is now, I'm always surprised by the objects students can bring. When Ateya came
you
with her
see them.
silos
Yeah,
in
yeah.
India, for example, I was looking at that stuff, and no, I think this is actually what has become fun in PhD program, that you see generation coming with new and very strange things, and it's true that new objects. If you
But it's also a question of questioning your own theoretical propensities,
Yeah,
what
by
you
the
see and
end,
what
yeah.
you don't see.
Oh yeah, it's true.
Or we all, I mean us, not just, yeah.
I may as well say the point I've been holding for so long. I think you may have given up a little bit too quickly in a way, Michael. I think there's a. I didn't mean to give up. No, I think.
You didn't look like
I think if we're talking about maybe social totalities or social context as something we're kind of agreeing on in a way, as for Adorno, that was what preceded everything, right? I mean, that was what was known that would then let you know about architecture, maybe. In the I mean, not just in cultural techniques or media studies, but everything since Foucault, that's precisely what is constructed, right? I mean, cultural construction, and I mean, this is the starting point of media studies, that you look at the materiality because you assume that out of that is going to come its own unique totality, and so you can't presuppose the medium in the way that Adorno did, right? And there's there's a kind of radical difference there, right?
No, I think this idea of this, how we understand totality and what Marxists call totalization, which is not a thing, it's a process, would be another kind of divide between.
I think it's, for me, what I retain is finally two questions. One is precisely, how do we reconstruct? Do we reconstruct or not a totality or a category of similar objects, etc.? The second question, which is still unanswered, but I don't think we can answer it, is why do we write history in design school, which is for me still, because I think behind that, one of the answer I heard, for example, why do we do that today? It's because the practice is evolving. I found it quite interesting, because actually what their practice of architecture has changed, which I think is an interesting question.
I think I need to wrap this up. I just wanted to express my how impressed I am by Antoine's expression of his newfound tolerance, and to let us all recall that
I'm a scary, tolerant person.
the Edict of Nantes was given and then it was revoked. So, but I want to thank Michael, I want to thank Mary Lou, and all our various participants in the conversation.